Hello. I think it's a good time to start. All the important people are in the room. My name is Warwick Mckibben. I'm the Director of the Centre for Applied Macroeconomic Analysis here at the ANU. We're co-organising this conference with CEPAR. And my other hat is that I'm a Chief Investigator at CEPAR and have joined CEPAR in the new round of funding. John was very convincing, and people have been surprised that I'm here today because I don't normally work on pensions and social security systems. I work on things that are really important and really interesting. And so when John approached me, he was very convincing. It's like being asked to join the Boston Red Sox, and when you get a pitcher like John who can sell the story to you about why this is important, I was on board immediately. The session this afternoon is about policy implementation, and we have two excellent speakers and two excellent discussants. The first speaker is Jeremy Cooper, who I really don't have to introduce to people in this room, but I will. He's Chairman of Retirement Income at Challenger Limited. He chaired the Cooper Review into the superannuation system, and he's also, before that, was the Deputy Chairman of the Australian Securities and Investment Commission. We'll be following Jeremy with Marian Baird. Marian is a colleague of mine. She's a Chief Investigator within CEPAR. She's Professor of Gender and Employment Relations at the University of Sydney, and she's the Head of the Discipline of Work and Organisational Studies and Co-Director of the Women, Work and Leadership Research Group in the Sydney Business School. As mentioned last night, but it's worth mentioning again, she's one of the top, most influential people in the world working on gender equality. So it's great to have you both here. I'll introduce the discussants in the next round, and please, I'll turn over now to Jeremy to do his presentation.
Thanks, Warwick. I promised this would be 20 to 25 minutes, so there's quite a lot to get through. And what I've done is I've broken it into fairly logical topics that you can see there. And I've also done my own framing of what the topic was actually about. And I've started off with a somewhat edgy, I suppose, critique of really, if you go to the ASIC Act, which I'm sure most of you do most evenings, Section 1, subsection 2 actually has enumeration of things that ASIC must strive for in doing its work, and it's really quite an interesting read. It's asked to grow the economy and save business costs and do all sorts of interesting things, but one of the central ideas is that it's promoting the informed participation of investors and consumers in the financial system. And, you know, there's a lot of heavy lifting involved there, and in fact there's a lot of evidence that, of course, most people out there are not confident and not informed. So, and these ideas, underpinning these ideas is a strong belief in financial literacy. Now, all Western governments promote financial literacy, just something that you have to do, but it's often a bit of wallpaper for very confusing products and very difficult choices. Oh, we just need to roll out a little bit more financial literacy and everything will be fantastic. I think we've learnt that disclosure really doesn't work at the retail level, and as people who think about this say, it's a necessary but not a sufficient condition, and I think we could call clear, concise and effectively dead. It just has not been properly engaged with or understood. And I don't need to tell the CEPAR audience that financial literacy and numeracy actually decline with age. And I don't mean that to be meant in the wrong way, but I'm on the boat too. And yet, although, as I'll get to in a minute, we have some very successful defaults in the system at the moment, the thinking is that in retirement that we're not going to pull the default or even the auto-enrolment lever, but we're actually going to go down the choice route. So I suppose pausing there, and what I'll do is, so you're not distracted, I'll go to a fairly crude diagram that I used when we were coming up with the idea of my super and it basically divides the retirement or the super system into 4 boxes. The tragedy of lost accounts, there's still $18 billion worth of lost super sitting out there, and I really don't think there's much we're going to be able to do about that. Then the no choice option of My Super, and then with increasing responsibility, we then go into the choice box and ultimately to the self-managed box, where you get the maximum amount of choice and the maximum amount of responsibility. So that's the sort of graphic around choice and defaults and guidance. But I guess I just wanted to paint a thumbnail sketch, and I really don't have a lot of time. Thumbnail sketch of really where we are in the retirement phase at the moment, where we've got a pretty large quantity of products out there, but they're really still wealth management products. And so what they are is they're effectively wealth creation products that are then turned upside down in retirement, and you draw the money out of them. They're actually not, they're not properly designed risk management or pooled retirement products. And this is an issue because at the moment we've got somewhere around $800 to $900 billion actually already in the retirement phase. Now, those numbers are a little bit wobbly because we're yet to see the impact of the people who had more than 1.6 million in retirement actually wind that money back to the accumulation phase. Some people are saying that's a figure of somewhere between 150 and $200 billion. Also, oddly, there's another 100 billion of people who are over 65 but haven't actually moved their money into retirement phase yet. It's a lot of moving around, but be assured it's a very big number. And we really haven't embraced what I call pension finance. In other words, the consumption, the smooth consumption of capital that's been built up in accumulation, the smooth consumption of that to increase your standard of living and to take the worry and the risk out of retirement. There's a pretty, that is not a sort of common concept in retirement at the moment. Of course, it's what's sitting behind the government's CEPAR reforms. Now, we can see that My Super is working pretty well. I don't want to get into the whole Royal Commission stuff, but there's already $675 billion sitting in the My Super framework, and consumers are not having to make decisions, they're being made for them. So that works pretty well. When we shift to retirement, what we see is a much more individualised experience. So I regard a saving 40-year-old as relatively generic, a pea in a pod compared to the 65-year-old, 67-year-old about to retire. They are much more individualised, but not that individualised at the mass level. And I think the CEPAR idea of having three sort of flagship CEPARs all pointed at fairly large cohorts of people, mainly dissected by wealth, is an idea that can work. And that's really what was sitting behind the FSI recommendation and the subsequent CEPAR reforms. So moving along, let's have a quick look at the retiree fact base. So we've got 700 Australians retiring every day. In the US, that figure is 10,000. But nonetheless, it's a significant number of people wanting to access their savings in retirement. And the amounts of money these people have are actually considerably more at the household level than is commonly thought. So a lot of data in the superannuation system is a little bit like knowing the average depth of Sydney Harbour, which ranges from sort of 3 metres to 90 metres. Knowing the average is more or less useless. So we often get system averages in this game. But it's really what people have on the verge of retirement, and in most cases, what they have as a household that really is the sharpest number. So what we find is that a vast majority of people go into retirement in some form of household, whether that's a marriage, a de facto arrangement, or other arrangements where resources are pooled in retirement. And we reckon in the 60 to 64-year-olds, that's a solid 3/4. So we reckon 77% based on digging into various data points is what we're looking at retirement. And then when you consolidate all their multiple accounts and put those numbers together, you get a current day average of about 507,000, and at the median, it's around 400,000. So, as I say to people, you can't buy a sheep station with that amount of money, but what you can do is take the pain off retirement, and that money can be spent safely through the course of retirement. Now, we've heard a bit about the age pension. What we're seeing is a very rapid, because these are not new numbers, this is a 2017 number, we're seeing a very rapid decrease in the number of people who are in retirement. Now, it's really important to understand this number. So 42% of people in the entire over 65 age group are on the full pension. That includes people who are over 90 and never had any superannuation at all. This is not the 65-year-old. We can't get the disaggregated data to see what the new retirees are like, but I guarantee you it'd be somewhere in the 30s of people who are starting retirement on a full age pension. So flip this number around, what it means is 58% of people are either completely sustaining themselves in retirement or at least partly sustaining themselves. And what this says to the super system is great. So the reason for this is it's really largely because of super balances. People are working longer as well, but it's a victory for the super system. But what the strong message it sends is that the super system has to make up the difference for so many people who are sustaining themselves and not getting any age pension. The super system needs to provide stable, lifetime, dependable, regular income for these retirees who are really getting no government help. To show the trend here, in 2010, we had 45% people on the full rate age pension. Now we're saying 42, and ASFA are predicting that as close as 2025, that number will go down to 30%. And so you'll have 40% of people in that age group who are getting no age pension whatsoever. So that's a dramatic change. It used to be assumed, particularly by large industry funds, that really all of their retiring members were going to be on the full age pension. That was a pretty reasonable assumption at the time. That is now absolutely not the case. So we spend a lot of time saying retirement's different. We use this mountain graphic to show that the ascent is really the accumulation phase, but the going down the mountain, the metaphor is all about consuming the capital. Finding the right way to go down the mountain is what we're trying to do in retirement. The wealth management industry, of course, wants you to stay at the top and not consume your capital. And there's a lot of tension out there in the industry at the moment between what you might call the investment-only retirement, where what you spend, it's a bit like the old saying of buy the bond and spend the coupons, but you're only spending what you would regard as accounting income, so dividends, rent, etc., and you're keeping the capital. And our system very much requires you to consume that capital. So there's a bit of a class war going on at the moment on this, and you can see this around the franking credit refund debates, that people are regarding the little cheque that you get from the government as income. They might have $700,000 or $800,000, $900,000 worth of capital. There's no sense of them being able to consume any of that capital for retirement income. Income is actually what you receive in your account, and that is going to have to change. So what do retirees value about their finances in retirement? We do regular surveys with national seniors, and time after time they're rating regular income that lasts for life. What they're really saying to us, I guess, is that I had a paycheck while I was working, I want that paycheck in retirement. And instead, what I'm given is a lump of capital. I have to be Warren Buffett all of a sudden in retirement. I've got to live off capital, whereas I've had 40 years worth of income, and what I really want in retirement is actually income. Here's another way of looking at it. Ignore the top bar. I think that was a pretty difficult question, but again, the proportion of people who said they liked regular and stable income, and the proportion of people who say they wanted income that lasts for life are pretty dramatically the majority. So what are retirees actually doing out there? So this is a chart that looks at spending patterns over the course of retirements in two different timeframes. The first one was couples in 2009-10, second one was couples in 2015-2016. And the green bars are about actually their spending on essentials. So this is the gas bill, the electricity bill, food and stuff. And what we see is, relatively speaking, through retirement, those figures are more or less constant. And the blue bars are discretionary spending. A little bit dependent on how much you've got, but it's generally a pattern of the expenditure on holidays and stereo systems and whatever else people spend their discretionary money on goes down as you get older. No big surprise about that. And of course, what we're also seeing here is a bit of a cohort effect, is that each younger cohort has got more money to start off with. And again, that super balance is largely driving that. Majority of people still worry about running out of money. This question is cut on, do you have a plan that deals with longevity or do you not? So the green histogram are people who say they've got a plan to deal with the longevity. And again, with surveys, you never quite know whether they actually understand what that question really means, but you just have to cross your fingers. But I guess what it's showing is that around about 50% of people out there are worried about running out of their savings. So in thinking about all these issues, let's think about what we would implement, what we would actually do for retirees, based on a sort of choice world. ASIC did a very interesting capability study into seniors, which they released in seniors in this case being 55 and over, 55 to 85 in fact. And this is a question that really asks people in that age group, do you understand asset diversification? And do you understand a risk and return, what the trade-off of risk and return is? In other words, as you get a higher return, you're accepting more risk. 46% didn't know what diversification meant, and 64% didn't understand what the risk and return trade-off was. Now, if you take that at face value, it's very difficult to then take the leap of confident and informed decisions about your retirement. Now, those figures could be wrong, but I think if ever there were challenges with financial literacy, of course, where's the worst group going to be? People who are on the verge of retirement and in retirement. They're not in the education system. Their mental faculties are at least in some degree of decline. So if you're going to roll out financial literacy as a tool, you really can't roll it out across your retired population. You've just really got to work out. You've got to work with what you've got, I think, is the answer there. Here's a risk aversion one. A little bit. You probably can't see this terribly well, but basically, on your left there, you're basically looking at 25% of respondents said, look, I don't want to bear any risk in retirement whatsoever, and around about 50% of the group said 10%, I either want no risk at all, or I'll take up to 10% of risk in retirement. Of course, during October, the ASX kindly fell by a little bit more than 10%. So you can see that retirees who are exposed to direct equities are going to be exhibiting a fair bit of anxiety. So I think the message there is that in a lot of products, the risk settings are way above. It might, in broad terms, be thought to be in the best interests of retirees, but when you ask them about risk, they are much more risk averse than a lot of products that they're invested in. Then again, a lot of you will be highly familiar with this. Basically, this is a sort of a Danny Kahneman example of people that are just really hopeless natural statisticians. They can't instantly annuitise a lump sum. You throw out a figure of 100,000 and they find it very, very difficult to actually price what a lifetime income off that amount would be. And here's an experiment where you can either take a 100,000 lump sum, 300 a month in today's dollars for the rest of your life, 500 in today's dollars for the rest of your life, or indeed $900 in today's dollars for the rest of your life. The actuarially fair figure would be, somewhere around it depends on your age and a whole bunch of things, but it'd be about half $900, let's put it that way. People nearly always wanted the lump sum, and then if they were sort of forced to make a decision there in difference point, in other words, the point where they sort of couldn't care whether it was the 100,000 or an income stream, was actually $1,065 a month, kind of way over the sort of actuarially fair amount. So again, this is a pure financial literacy thing that people find it difficult to understand when they've got their capital amount, what it actually translates to in terms of lifetime income. I'm getting pretty much through it at the moment. I've mentioned this, it's just axiomatic that as you get older you find these complex decisions even more difficult. The other day someone suggested to me that animals pool risk. And when you think about it, fish will shoal to protect the whole group. Wildebeest will herd together to protect the stragglers, and so it's quite an interesting metaphor for really what part of the solution is in retirement, is that people need to pool their capital together and hedge the investment and idiosyncratic risks that they're facing. And this, of course, has already been mentioned. Andrew Podger, who mentioned before that people are looking for outcomes that are a little bit more like a DB pension than the current product they've got. And of course, last but not least, the policy solution that's on the table is the comprehensive income product from retirement. This is a slightly stylised version of the triangle that was in the FSI final report that really showed the tensions, and I think Mercer also had an elegant trilemma of things that pull against each other. In other words, they're trade-offs, but a product that seeks to meet those three things. But most importantly, the grey jigsaw piece in the middle of peace of mind is an extremely important thing in retirement. And on that note, I will hand over to Warwick to introduce Marian.
Thanks, Jeremy. I've already introduced Mary, so I'll just make way and you can have the...
If I can work out how to do that. Yeah, I'm on. Hi, everyone. Thank you, Warwick, very much for hosting us here. Nice to be in Canberra. I'll just get rid of Jeremy's. And thanks, Jeremy. And put mine up. Great. So I suppose I'm taking a slightly different angle on our discussions today and want to look at women and work, what I've called choices over the life cycle. And one of the issues I'm picking up on here is that we get to retirement as a result of being through a lifetime of work. And that's what I want to examine. So I also want to sort of really challenge us a little bit to think about the whole notion of choice, and I know it's already been raised, to consider that for some people there's much more choice than others, and for most women, our literature and theories show us that our choices are very constrained because of a whole range of other factors in our lives. And I also wanted to remind us of the two architects of our superannuation system in Australia. 1992, the Accord, a period of social partnership, a very unusual period as it turns out in Australia's political history. You may recognise those men. I also point out that they're men, and they did a great job. They designed a scheme that I think most people around the world have seen as one of the most innovative retirement schemes or pension schemes around. The other part of it to remember, of course, is it was part of a debate and part of a trade-off. So to forego wages in order to get a superannuation scheme. And I think that's very important. And you do occasionally hear people remember that, and unions remember it in bargaining rounds, and employers remember it in bargaining rounds, because employers will pick up this issue. If you ask for a greater superannuation component of your agreement, they'll trade that off with your wages. So this is a very complex and composite picture. But I point out that they were men who were very interested in the men's unions, and they were very successful. But let's go a bit further down the track. When we think about women and retirement, we have to think about a lot of other things that go on, and I'm arguing that we need to take a particular gender lens. We can't assume that women's workforce patterns or labour market attachment is the same as men's. It's increasingly looking more like men's, but it certainly isn't yet. And Axel, I was really interested in your graphs, which at least did note that they were all male labour force patterns that you were talking about. And I thought that was very important that you did distinguish that as well. And I think a life cycle approach really helps us understand what happens to people as they come to reach the end of their working lives and enter their retirement lives, both for men and women, but I will take a female approach. And of course, as a result of that, the income women have at retirement is quite different to that which men have access to, and that we have to consider this within a context of preferences and constraints. And also that the choice is actually a very neoliberal concept in itself, and many people who really critiques of that system see it as really risk shifting, putting the risk onto individuals who, as we've just heard, actually don't have the knowledge or the experience or equal information. So there's a real asymmetry in the market for these products. So this is an important aspect to consider. But what we are seeing is that there are many more women in the workforce today, and I'll come to that in a moment in some graphs. But why is that? They're much more educated than they have been, perhaps not in a financial literacy way, but certainly women's qualifications are greater than men's in Australia now. They're outstripping men at university by 10 to 12%. So we're seeing quite a gap emerging there, an interesting social issue for Australia to consider. They have different expectations, they have very different patterns of work. Flexibility at work is said to suit women, that's on the supply side. Flexibility at work also suits employers on the demand side. Women do have financial security concerns, especially as they approach older age. But we're seeing a major industry restructure in Australia, where the growth industries are the industries that women are working in and will work in. So as we look forward into where will people work and who is in the workforce, I think we have to consider this industry restructuring, not just because of where people are working, but because the wage rates are very different. And we're also in a period of wage stagnation, which means people are putting less into their retirement and superannuation schemes. And I think we need to factor that into our considerations. We have talked about GDP. A couple of the speakers this morning mentioned that GDP is important, and the Australian government, along with the other G20 countries, have committed to this goal of closing the gender employment gap, or participation gap actually, the gender participation gap by 25% by 2025, and that this will lead to a direct increase in GDP. Now, we can debate the merits of the GDP as a measure, but there is certainly a government policy to promote increased female participation. And I think we have to consider, well, what are the trade-offs we're making then within households and within a community, and how do we actually finance the work that women have been doing in the household that we want them to do in the marketplace now. So someone did mention this morning that men's participation was increasing. Well, not in Australia. Labour force participation for men has been on a steady decline. For women, it's been on a steady rise. We seem to have reached perhaps a little bit of a plateau. The line down the middle is when superannuation was introduced, 1992. I'm not drawing any correlations there. I just put it in because I thought, oh, that's sort of interesting. You can see a slight increase in women then, although they started earlier, but you start to see that sort of dropping of men at that point. If we turn to employment rates of men and women, these are comparing over 40 years, 78 and 2018. And I wonder if the point is working. Yeah, these top arcs are men's labour market employment, or attachment to the labour market employment rates. And we see that the pattern of those hasn't really changed dramatically. It's the classic pattern: enter the labour market, continue at work until you reach whatever the retirement age is, except for men in 2018, we have a constant, about a 10% difference. So men's overall employment and participation in Australia is about 10% down than on what it was 40 years ago. Various explanations for that. I think perhaps the most feasible might be the change in industry structure, but there are other factors that have fed into that. Here we have female participation rates. This is the 1978 pattern, the classic pattern, the M curve and the nappy valley in this period here, when women left the labour market to have their children and then returned to work. But look at what's happening now. Women enter the labour market. In fact, the inverse is happening. They're not leaving the labour market in any way to the same degree as they did in the 40 years ago. They're delaying childbirth, so we have a little bit of a nappy valley now. It's a plastic nappy, I suppose. And we don't, and they re-enter the labour market much more rapidly. I've done a huge amount of research around what's happening here. But this is really interesting because this is older women in Australia, and look at the huge difference in 40 years of older women's participation in the labour market. People in the room have experienced that. They're the generation who are educated, have come through, and there's something like a 38%, I haven't done the measure, difference, 35%, massive difference. Now, that of course has all sorts of implications for what they earn and what's going to happen when they do leave the labour market. But what's been happening during their lifetime, I've just said all that, sorry. What's been happening during their lifetime is actually very interesting. We've had a massive shift, a massive gender shift in the composition of our labour market, but we've had absolutely no shift in the proportion of women working full-time. And in fact, the proportion of women working full-time in Australia today is less than it was 40 years ago. So all the increase in female labour market attachment is in part-time work. And that has a lot of consequences for how much they can accumulate by the time they leave the labour market. Men's full-time work has also decreased, and in fact, that sort of matches pretty well the shift that we've seen in labour market attachment by men. Most of that happens with younger men and older men. So students who work part-time and older men who have either left the full-time labour market and gone into some sort of contract or casual work and can't get full-time work. So a significant shift has occurred, but it's not as great as we might have thought. So the life cycle approach, and I'll just run through this pretty quickly to sort of build on what I'm saying. When women begin their entry point into the labour market, they're very highly educated. And their early career patterns are tending to reflect men's. They're entering the labour market into a diverse range of occupations and professions, and they're working in a similar way to men's. As you can see, oops, sorry, given away everything. You can see there that they're pretty close. I've covered it up by the arrow a bit, but men and women are doing about the same thing. By the time women get to their early 30s, when they have their first child, they do leave the labour market for a short period of time. They have maternity leave. We do now have a paid parental leave system of sorts in Australia. The USA doesn't. Most European countries are much more advanced in their parental leave systems than we are. They take maternity leave and then they come back to work and they work part-time. And we know that over 70% of women who had a full-time job before they had their first baby returned to work in a part-time capacity. And this is the Australian compromise. This is what households in Australia do. It's the 1.5 model or the 1+ breadwinner model. Very hard in Australia, given our lack of childcare and our, until recently, quite inflexible workplace practices for both the mother and father to work in full-time jobs. They experience a certain amount of stigma because they work in flexible jobs, and they often have to go down a lower level in skill, so they earn less money. That's work and care and flexism. Mature age women are also experiencing a certain amount of tension in the labour market as they increasingly try to combine elder care with their working practices. So if we put the lot together, what you have is this curious thing that at the beginning, women are actually more qualified. So their human capital investment is greater than men's, but immediately they start to earn less than men on graduation and their first jobs, there's about a $1,000 to $2,000 difference, and that compounds as they go through motherhood, the period of work and care, and mature age work, because they experience a pay gap, an hours gap, and eventually a superannuation gap. So what do we do to alleviate this? These are just some other graphs to show that what's happened in Australia is that the part-time share, as I mentioned before, has increased. That's our big shift in our labour market. That's full-time employment, showing that data a different way. But here you can see that women 35 to 44, I suppose when we've got young children, their full-time employment rates are less than they used to be. Okay, so what has shifted? A lot has shifted in terms of women into the labour market. Very little has happened in the home. And although we do hear quite a bit of talk about shifting gender roles and role reversal, this study by the Australian Institute of Family Studies is very interesting, because it shows that the number of stay-at-home dads has actually barely moved. It's 5%. Women are still carrying the greater proportion of the care responsibilities. So not only do we have a pay gap, we have a care gap. And why do people not work full-time? This is from the Reserve Bank. We have a number of reasons people give: studying, a preference, caring for children, other reasons, job requirements, and could not find full-time work. So there are various reasons why this is happening, but we do know that it's women on the whole, especially through their prime working years, who are working part-time. We've seen similar data this morning, actually, ranking Australia. In terms of part-time employment, we come third after the Netherlands and Switzerland. So that's sort of interesting, in that this could be both a positive model, depending on how you read it, or a negative model. And that's the policy decision we have to make. What are the implications of this arrangement that we have? Well, one thing is that we have a major pay gap. On the left, we have male full-time adult average weekly ordinary time earnings, and on the right we have total earnings. And you can see that the pay gap increases because in total earnings we're including women's part-time work as well as full-time work for men. So the pay gap is quite significant. If you have a pay gap, given that your superannuation comes from your wages, you're going to have lower superannuation balances for women. I mentioned the future a while ago. Where is the growth going to happen? Well, we know that Australia has a very gender-segregated labour market. We have one of the most gender-segregated labour markets in the OECD, and that isn't shifting. In fact, we seem to be hardening our occupational gender distributions. So we can see that healthcare and social assistance, education and training are primarily female-dominated industries, retail, trade and accommodation also female. And it's not till we get to professional, scientific and technical services, manufacturing, transport and construction that we see the men dominating those sectors. What's the other thing you notice about those sectors that are dominated by females? They tend to rely on government funding, which puts a huge constraint on the ability of workers in those industries to request pay rises, because where does the money have to come from? It has to come from the tax system, and people have to agree that that's where we're going to put our money. So women tend to work in the domestic industries and those that are heavily reliant on funding from government. I did speak to Jeremy before because we were having a bit of a discussion about, well, so I've been talking about how you get to a superannuation sort of position for women. But of course, amongst the people I do a lot of work with, we still argue that the age pension is very, very important for women. And it's been good to see that discussion today about Pillar 1 and other pillars, because women probably will rely more on the age pension than men given their workforce experiences. Now, that may change as the cohort moves through, but then we will have a bigger difference in our superannuation, a big superannuation gap between men and women because of those working time patterns I've already explained. So for Australia as a whole, you can see that, I have to look, these are thousands, so about 140,000 women and about 110,000 men rely on the age pension, recipients of the age pension. So there is a gender gap in that as well. So how can we increase women's retirement savings? Well, this has come up already. We definitely have to try and remove the $450 a month threshold because a lot of women are in short hours jobs where that threshold kicks in. I have also spoken to a lot of unions. In those sectors I've spoken to, I've indicated are female dominated. It's also an incentive for employers to keep those jobs fragmented, to keep them under that threshold. We need to close the gender pay gap while women are at work, and we need to do something about the care gap to even up that who's working and who's not working, or find some other compensations there. We need to value women's jobs appropriately. There's a Fair Work Commission role in this, and they have just recently knocked back one decision and allowed another over the last 5 years on valuing, well, it's a very technical set of arguments that I won't go into at the moment, but it's this issue of what the comparator is, whether you have a male comparator or not, or whether you can value jobs on the inherent quality of the job. Labor have made a small step forward in saying that superannuation should be added to the parental leave payment. This is only, of course, for a short period of time, 18 weeks, and it's also paid at the minimum wage, which means that it's not a major superannuation contribution. And there's been some estimates of what that would do. There's discussion, has been discussion in the past from the Human Rights Commission to provide earned income tax credits for low-wage working parents that would somehow offset the income and perhaps allow greater accumulation for retirement. And of course, perhaps think about this issue of revising the age pension for single women who rent, who are a particularly at-risk category. So in total then, closing the gender pay gap over the working life cycle of a woman would make the greatest impact on retirement balances, and RAF has done a little bit of work on that. But of course, in order to do that, you have to close the care gap, and one doesn't happen without the other. So these are the interconnectedness of our systems and the way our society really. And this is the calculation that RAF has done, and it's in book 3 of the 3 that were distributed today. Thanks very much, RAF. But the question is, I don't think that the gender gap in superannuation or retirement will ever be closed because of our institutional structures and life cycle structures. It would take a dramatic re-engineering of our society to actually close that gap. And so perhaps we have to think of other means, other mechanisms to enable women and men to reach retirement in some sort of equal part. So thank you very much, and I'd also like to thank Alison Williams, who's with me today, who assisted in putting together our slides. Thank you.
Thanks, Marian, and thanks, Jeremy. So Jeremy focused on the important difference between a regime based on choice and a default system, and really stressed the importance of the lack of people's financial understanding in making choice decisions. He also pointed out that the current system is not well designed for the withdrawal phase and importance of pension finance. I learned 2 important things from Jeremy's presentation. One is that I am now statistically a senior. And that the other interesting point was that in the lack of understanding in our modelling work, in order to track the macro data, we assume that only 30% of the consumers in our models are rational and use the model, and 70% use a rule of thumb, which is very simple. And it's interesting that your survey reinforces those assumptions that we make. On Marian's presentation, which took a very different focus, focused on the importance of the difference between men and women, and particularly the role of women in the workforce and the importance of part-time employment for women. And the thing that really stuck out to me were the gaps, the pay gap, the hours gap, the super gap and the care gap. So now we have two discussants who are highly qualified to discuss the two papers or two presentations. Firstly, Susan Thorp. Susan Thorp is Professor of Finance at the University of Sydney and an Associate of CEPAR. I've known Susan actually since she was an undergraduate student, which actually really dates me. No, I didn't mean it like that. But the thing about Susan was she's a really remarkable person. When she was at the Reserve Bank, as well as being a mother and having beautiful kids, she worked and produced some amazing papers in her very early stages at the bank. I then sort of lost contact with her, and now she's become Professor of Finance at the University of Sydney, which is not surprising at all. And it's great to be able to introduce you today. Susan's published very widely in very good journals, excellent journals, in fact. The second speaker is Mike Orszag, who's the Head of Research at Willis Towers Watson. And he's got this interesting mix between academia and private consulting, private sector work, in the sense that he was the founding editor of the Journal of Pension Economics and Finance and the co-editor of the Oxford Handbook of Pensions and Retirement Income. So the two discussants now, we'll get you to make your comments and then the four of you can join on the stage for Q&A. Thank you.
I'm actually going to borrow from Marian's slides a bit to introduce my own comments. It's been a really interesting day and a wide-ranging discussion. But I want to draw your attention to the second dot point there, which actually also relies on RAF's work. And it notes the fact that in the last decade, the size of the super balance gap is almost halved. In 2016, women's balances at age 60 to 64 were 64% lower than men's. Now, I'm just going to talk about that difference. So there are large differences between men's and women's superannuations, accumulations at retirement. And we've noted that it's about 60%. And Marian's given us a fascinating tour through a lot of the underlying labour force structural reasons as to why that would be the case. So now, women, we also know, are more likely to live longer than men and more likely to rely on formal aged care. So reaching retirement with lower savings is a more acute problem for them in many cases than it is typically for a man. Now, Marian showed us that these differences between men's and women's lifetimes earnings is very persistent, and it will, as we've noted, show up in retirement accumulations almost of necessity. And this is partly because the superannuation system, as we've already discussed today, is a system that's designed to promote consumption smoothing, meaning that it's designed to help people maintain a relatively similar pattern of consumption across from their working lives into retirement. It's not, the superannuation guarantee itself is not essentially a redistributive system. It's mainly a consumption smoothing system. So, in fact, there's no surprise in seeing that, that these underlying differences in gender earnings pattern transmit into retirement savings balances. So we might expect to see that in some ways, and if we want to see that change, then we either have to think about creating a more redistributive system, which would actually be to some extent to change the goals of the system, or address the underlying structures in the labour force, which Marian has already noted very convincingly are both very slow to change and in some ways appear to be going backwards, if not staying still. So I actually don't want to comment on how the superannuation system actually reflects those differences in male and female earnings. What I want to do is comment on how some of the features of the system actually aggravate rather than ameliorate the differences between men and women. And because there are aspects of the superannuation system and the way that it operates that actually make things worse rather than making them better. And I want to argue that a really large proportion of that 60% difference is actually due to these structural problems in the way that the superannuation system operates, rather than just due to the differences between people's earnings patterns. Now, so let's take the main point, I think, the most surprising and convincing difference that Marian drew attention to, and that is part-time and intermittent work. Now, we know that this is not just an issue for women, it's an issue for many different types of people, but it's more typical, clearly more typical of women than it is for men. So we know that part-time employment means that women will move jobs more often. And we also know that that means that in the default settings we have in the superannuation system, such people are not favoured by the superannuation default settings. And in fact, the system is particularly detrimental to people who move in and out of the workforce. And that's because when people change jobs, they tend to change employer. And when they change employer, they tend to add to their collection of superannuation funds. They're much more likely to end up with multiple accounts than people who remain in full-time employment. And as we know, multiple accounts cut retirement balances by adding unnecessary administrative charges to people's fees. Now, the Productivity Commission, whose analysis I'm going to rely on heavily here, in their draft report estimated that having an additional account amounted to about a 6 percentage point deduction in your retirement account balance. So a multiple account is going to lower your retirement balance possibly by about 6%. Now, many women, and for that matter anybody who is moving in and out of the formal workforce, just like the gig economy workers that we've already been talking about, would certainly be helped by a once-only default system. So if we can move people into a system where it's easier to have one account and keep it for your whole life, that particular part of the gap we might be able to help close. Now, the second underlying structural problem that's associated with part-time work and moving in and out of the workforce relates to default life and TPD insurance. Now, that's life and TPD insurance inside superannuation is set up for full-time workers. Premiums are typically set on age, not on income. And in other words, people who work part-time pay premiums as if they worked full-time. So if that's going to be the case for you, your premiums are going to be too high. They're also likely to continue on being deducted for some time after you've stopped contributing, if you move out of the workforce, change jobs, get another account. So people who take time out of the workforce are typically keeping on paying premiums, at least for a certain period of time, and that's all made far worse by having multiple accounts. So again, the Productivity Commission estimates that retirement balances could be eroded by about 14% by paying insurance premiums that are unnecessary, inappropriate or too high. And if you have multiple accounts, that percentage could go up to about 25% of retirement balance. These are very substantial explanators of gaps between people who work full-time and people who work part-time. So what we can see is that the way that our choice architecture, and I'm with Hazel, I think lots of things about the choice architecture are excellent, but when it comes to certain patterns of work, the choice architecture works against people making substantial accumulations. So my rough estimate is that just these two factors alone could account for about a third of the gap that we observe between the genders at retirement in terms of accumulation. So then let's have a look at backloading of work. So one of the other things we noticed about a typical woman's work pattern is that there tends to be a bit of a dip at younger ages and a bigger bulge at older ages, to set aside the part-time work pattern. So in other words, women's earnings tend to be more backloaded in their life cycle. So in a defined contribution system, it's clearly a no-brainer that if your earnings are arriving later in your life cycle, you have less time to benefit from compounding than you would if your earnings were bunched towards the front of your life cycle. So roughly speaking, for every dollar that a woman or a worker who's not in the workforce in their 30s, for every dollar that they don't contribute in their 30s, they need to contribute about $3 in their 50s to get the equivalent effect of the compound interest over their life cycle. Now, we've talked about the systems in Europe, but one of the features of defined benefit systems is that they tend to favour, tend to give more weight to earnings at older ages. So the defined contribution system that we have is also a factor that really matters here. Now, not only that, there are other structural features in our system that don't favour people who've got these dips and humps in their earning cycle. The annual and lifetime limitations on concessional contributions in the Australian superannuation system also mean that women who are probably reaching their peak earnings in their 40s and 50s cannot get the advantages of the tax concessions the same way that they would had they smoothed their work hours over the course of their lifetime. Their concentration of their earnings and their savings towards the end of their life means that they can't benefit as much from the tax concessions. And the catch-up that's currently allowed for people who have taken a bit of break from their contributions is only a 5-year window. But this is obviously inadequate. Very few people who leave the workforce, say, to have a child, are likely to have spare income in the 5 years after that to contribute to the superannuation system. If we want flexibility around concessions, we need to have windows that operate over decades when we look at labour earnings patterns, not over tiny 5-year windows. And third, I want to refer to comments that Jeremy made in relation to financial literacy, which I also think are very important to consider in this context. There's been some recent work done with the HILDA data, where some financial literacy information was collected, that estimates the average gap between male and female financial literacy in Australia and puts the figure for financial literacy scores, a gap at about 15%, men about 15% higher than women. Now, this gender gap is not something peculiar to Australia. That's a worldwide phenomenon, and it's a real problem because low financial literacy is actually related to lower lifetime wealth and to less discerning financial choices. Now, in the superannuation system, even though there's a lot of things that operate by default and choice architecture, particularly the MySuper structures, can help us a great deal, it is the case that choices still matter to people's outcomes. And if we turn again to the Productivity Commission's recent report, we get an idea of just how much those poor decisions can actually contribute to this gap. So people who can't figure out that they're in an underperforming superannuation fund are likely to have about 12% lower balances at retirement, according to the Productivity Commission's calculations, just because they're in a fund that charges higher fees. So part-time and intermittent work patterns, backloading of earnings and lower financial literacy are more typical of women than they are of men, but they're typical of other people in the retirement system as well. And these features actually interact with structures inside the superannuation system in ways that can partly explain the gap that we observe between men's and women's retirement balances at ages 64 or 65. And my very rough calculation shows that if we fix these structural features of the system, this could raise the average percentage of female to male superannuation accumulations from around the 60% that Marian reported to about 85%. So before we even start to consider flexible contributions and the pay gap, if we could get the structures and the choice architecture right, we could make rapid improvements in those sorts of saving structures. Now, clearly, this is not only a gender issue. Increasingly, this will be a factor for both men and women. So I think we really need policymakers who are going to champion reforms to these structures. We need an industry that's prepared to adapt and make significant changes, even perhaps when sometimes it's not in their interests. And we need to introduce these changes to default structures, better standards of performance, and much better systems for consolidating and protecting accounts. And if we want to actually see these substantial improvements in efficiency. Thanks.
That was an outstanding contribution. Thanks, Susan. And I'll hand over now to Mike.
Just want to turn on the microphone here. Is it working properly? Really happy to be here. I'm the last discussant. And I actually would like to create a little bit of debate. Notwithstanding the excellent contributions from Jeremy and Marian and Susan, and there's some excellent points. I particularly like some of Susan's ideas about closing the gap. At the same time, just reflecting on some of the contributions, I remember in 2007 or so in Tokyo, giving a talk where I reflected on what people were talking about in the previous 10 years on annuities and how nothing had changed. And a lot of the issues, how attractive annuities are, but people don't buy them, they need education, they need help with their choice, have been around a really long time. And there's not been that much movement. Gender, I remember organizing workshops in London in the late 1990s, and very similar arguments. In some respects, things have got worse. I'm not questioning any of the data on gender differences. Things haven't moved that much. And as I was listening, I was reflecting on lenses that we haven't discussed today that could be useful to think about how to move the needle on some of these trends. The first is technology. And we've heard a lot today about efficiency of choice, lowering costs, but not that much about vision, like what future technologies might mean for the structure of how things are provided. I'm a big technology, since I've been a 7-year-old. I built computers when I was young, and I carry around 8 mobile phones, but I rarely use them for anything connected with pensions. I mean, because the interactivity is very infrequent. And so it's a bit of a jump to understand how technologies like blockchain, artificial intelligence, Internet of Things, even quantum computing could change what gets provided in Australia and elsewhere. So that's one debate, efficiency versus vision. We've gone very far down the route of efficiency. So we look at it with the current structures and we say, well, the current structures we almost project them forward, but then we criticize people for not having vision to understand an aging society. But we hold the platforms and everything else constant. And the second is identity politics, something that really bothers me. And I was conflicted listening to the talks on gender because it is identity politics. I mean, when you say we should provide special treatment for women, that's a lot like what I see going wrong in Hungary, in the United States, and elsewhere. I worry about sustainability. So if you argue that women deserve treatment this way, and it's based on their label rather than the activities they do, like they drop out of labor force, and then other people argue, the Aborigines say we want special treatment, and renters, they need special treatment. It becomes a problem that just leads to divisions in society, and I worry that some of the ideas, when I think about, and notwithstanding some of the excellent ideas I did here, I worry some of the ideas are dated, and a lot of the liberal thinking about adding income to people they need some new thinking and new ideas, and I just wanted to put a few things forward. Let me do technology first, because I think it's a very important topic that often gets underemphasized. I mean, every service, every area goes through various generations of services and an evolution. And during this period, people look at things from the lens of what they're currently doing. So in Australia, you look at what super does now and you say, well, it's going to do the same thing in 15, 20 years. But what's possible to do with technology changes, and then I say technology is important, someone will say, oh, robo-advice, that's, it's something to pay attention to, but it's not thought of as really introducing transformational change. And so the first generation of pension service would really be DB. I mean, and think about the difference between DB and DC. I mean, DC enabled a lot more flexibility. It had a lot of other problems, but a second generation, say DC, was partly enabled by technology. You have platforms in the United States, Fidelity and Vanguard. You have platforms to some degree in Australia that enable people to, and some of it's bad. Some of the choice architecture is expensive and doesn't work, but it's enabled changes. And then when problems have come up in the second generation, people say, well, let's do things with behavioral finance, let's do things with defaults, and think about it. And I actually want to think a bit about what the fourth generation will look like. So when we get past the generation of thinking about default options and smart choice and things like that, what would the world look like? And what could it look like? And I'm a bit skeptical about some of the benefits of defaults, because I see a lot of differences in what people consume, partly because I'm different. I mean, I consume weird things. I like bananas, I like mobile technology, and I just see people doing different things in terms of what they need in retirement. And you could say that I had a discussion with someone over lunch, which was excellent, about how insurance could cover some of this, but it can't cover all of it. I think there's quite a lot of difference in what people will consume and need to consume in their retirement needs, but you can't capture it efficiently through any existing advice mechanism. So what I'd actually really like is anyone observing me, you know, who had movies of me when I was a kid, anything I do, would know what my consumption patterns are. They're likely to continue, okay? I'm likely to want to carry around 10 mobile phones when I retire. Okay, it's strange, but that's what I want to do. I want to spend money on things that other people don't want to spend money on. John Piggott's not going to want to do the same thing. He'll want something different. But it'll be very clear, and as observational technology like Internet of Things takes off, I mean, even my clothing or mobile devices will detect what I'm spending, and presumably should match my actual benefits or what I'm investing in to what I'm going to need. I think it will happen automatically. It could be quite cheap. It's not ready yet, but I mean, we also have to think, you know, one of the issues I have with the whole issue of some of these products being, you know, set up in the way they are is that the price indices that people need in retirement, say with annuities, are different. So I need a different price index than John Pigott or someone who does something different than me. And I think that's going to be a really big deal. Not yet, but I think it's something to keep in mind. Why? Because if you look at the productivity draft report, it's all about costs being high and how the industry funds are great and the banks are bad. But, you know, again, the banks have a lot of the data to do the customizability. They may have other issues. But I think we have to think through this vision issue. So what's going to be the vision of what these products look like in the future in 10, 15 years? Because we are thinking ahead that far. On the issue of how to deal with the rise of identity politics and avoiding pensions going down this route, because remember, we want sustainable benefits. We don't want one government to come in and say, women get these benefits, and another say, oh, we're white men now in government and Donald Trump supporters, let's do something different, because that creates a lot of chaos, a lot of complexity. And so I think it needs to be based on observable characteristics. And the other thing that's important, like time out of the workforce or things like that, that may be highly correlated with what women do, but may change as some aspects of technology change the nature of work. The other thing that I think is extremely important is the focus on income, which has been predominant in the last 20 or 30 years. Such a big focus that everything's about income. It's about extra contributions, it's about subsidies. Something people revolt against to some degree because of personal dignity. I think it needs to be more about services, about consumption. When I analyze in the rise of some of these identity politicians, a lot of it has to do with personal dignity, but also a lot of it has to do with the fact that people feel that they're constrained in terms of their choices, in terms of getting ahead. Particularly in the United States, the price of services, the price of education, the price of healthcare. And in this regard, I mean, to what degree is the industrial organization in Australia a problem that causes gender differences in pensions? So for instance, childcare. I mean, childcare is a really important service. Instead of subsidizing childcare, could you make it easier for childcare centers to open so there can be more of them? I mean, so I think the focus needs to move in the debate about pensions and sorting out some of these problems a bit away from the income side, much more towards the consumption side. And actually, that's a general reaction I had today. There's too much focus on income and not enough on sustainable consumption. And I think that when I saw the figure in Australia and the poverty, I think part of it was that. And I think it also would help analyze health, because it's very hard to analyze health in terms of income, but you can think about health poverty in terms of what people consume and the problems it has. So to summarize, I think just, you know, it's very interesting listening to all this, but I think the two debates that need to be more poignant in the future are the role of technology. So how much do we focus on what platforms are currently available and how we get better efficiency out of them, but at the same time, how do we balance that with the future? And then on identity politics is a very real problem. And all these issues that have come up, like gender, are very serious problems, and they're not getting better, at least from what I've seen in evidence around the world. On the other hand, I'm not sure the traditional ways of dealing with them that people have pursued I've seen it pursued for some time, are having the effect that's desired. So I think it's time for looking at slightly different ways of approaching it, and some of the changes in labor markets might be helpful and conducive to doing so. Thank you.
Okay, can I ask the presenters and discussants to come to the front? We'll take questions from the floor, but before we do that, I think we'll ask the two presenters if they wish to respond to any of the comments before we do the Q&A.
No, I'd rather the Q&A. I mean, I'm happy to do that.
Okay.
I think, yeah,
Jeremy, do you
people
want
have got ideas and want to
Sounds like
chat.
a good idea to me.
Yeah.
Yep.
Okay, so please put up your hand if you wish to ask a question, and I'll direct the microphone to you. Just up here. We have got plenty of time too. We've got 30 minutes, so there's plenty of time for questions and answers.
It was interesting, Jeremy's first graph was of households and the amount that households had in super. I'm wondering how much gender differences might disappear, especially the difference between married couples and singles. We all know the disasters of late life divorce and splitting assets, and I just wonder how that might pan out, how much the figures look different when we look at households versus men versus women.
Oh, they look very different. I guess that's the whole point, in the sense that we, in our system, because it's workplace-based, the second pillar, we save it up individually, and a fund will relate to the individual person whose account that is, but they don't know whether that person's actually in a household or not. It's one of my great, I should have thought of this in my super, a little sort of data marker of particularly identifying a single female might have been a very helpful way of getting more engagement and so on. So it makes the gender gap and the gender debate very different, but then you flip the coin over and you say, well, for all those people who are not in a household, they're the real issue. And it's another financial literacy issue, I think, particularly for women. It just kind of explaining this more sharply, that, you know, it's a bit like trying to buy a house by yourself. So it just sheds more of a light on it. I think ultimately, as we are picking up on Michael's point about technology, I think we're going to have to get to a position where any super fund talking to a retiree or guiding a retiree towards retirement is going to have the household view. It's going to have to know what assets are outside super, particularly where you're getting into tailored products that involve longevity solutions. You're going to have to see the whole picture.
Yeah. Can I just follow up to the being single all my life and never divorced or anything like that? I'm not aware of what the provisions are, but I know they've changed a lot with splitting super with divorce. But what are the provisions for when usually the man dies first? Are there any requirements about who gets the benefits and whether spouses, if it's a working woman who's got super, that ensures they get sort of a fair share?
Typically, yes. I mean, there are twists and turns and so on, and products that have built-in reversionary status as well. But typically, the surviving female will get the super balance, yeah.
Mark?
Sorry, I just want to pick up on the previous question, also, Mike, your response. But the taxation system or the social security system often puts together couples. You know, whether it's aged care, you're assessed as a couple.
Yep.
And the tax system does in part. But in relation to super, it doesn't. And so it doesn't allow, for instance, where one partner, generally it might be the woman, it might not be, takes time off to have a child, but they don't enable the remaining partner to then split their super, so the other half goes to their partner. Or to take a whole of life approach to savings, so that if a woman is out of the reporting period, she should be able to catch that up over the whole remaining workforce. And I don't know why that isn't too difficult for the government to handle, and why that wouldn't address some of the inequities we've got.
Yeah,
Maybe it doesn't change the answer at the end of the day for a couple, but it might for a divorce.
I think the government often sees pooling as, you know, splitting incomes and so on as just another form of tax evasion. I think at the moment, well, I think what you're talking about happens in a very personal and somewhat untalked about and clunky way, where there's a sort of, in a sense, I'm showing my lawyer training here, there's a sort of hypothecation, if you like, it's probably not even spoken about, but effectively the man saying, well, I'll slog through the workforce while you're looking after the kids, which is an incredibly important job, and implicitly, you know, we're going to be sharing, you know, if things work out, we're going to share the super in retirement. Now, if it doesn't work out, the family law system comes in to support, but here's a twist. Often, I think what happens there is that the woman will take the real estate and doesn't pick up the super in the split of assets. I haven't really drilled into the data, but anecdotally that's it, and you can understand why. So that's not a great outcome in terms of when it doesn't work out. But I think when people are busy working, there's this implicit agreement, and maybe that's the financial literacy point. Maybe that needs to be more explicit and more understood, is exactly what sort of trade-offs are going on in those financial partnerships.
And I think it's interesting in Australia, we have some of our systems are based on just on the individual and some are the couple. So parental leave is measured on individual incomes, not on the couple's income. So, it's a real sort of tension in our policy making, perhaps, about which way do we want to go, measure women as individuals and men as individuals or as couples. And it's a policy question in the end, but given what happens over the life cycle and the shifts in gender roles and what may go wrong, I think it is something we do have to look at. And I didn't take up the issue, but perhaps I should. I would have to take issue with the fact that I don't think it's identity politics we're talking about here. We're just talking about somehow equalising some of the obvious inequities that Susan pointed out that are just, they're structural in the system, probably because it was designed by men at a time when men were predominantly working full-time. I mean, it's not to blame them at the time, but to say all structures need changing over time as the social fabric changes, and I think that's what we're at now.
So I have Axel, and then I have a question over here.
So this was a factual question. What happens to divorce?
With
the superannuation...
It's split. It's a marital asset which gets split. That used not to be the case, but there were amendments about 15 years ago that meant that in a marital breakup that superannuation vehicles and other things can be penetrated by the family law, and it's all put together and then typically split.
Okay, that should decrease the super gap quite a bit.
Yeah.
But you don't, you don't necessarily...
I think the trade-off I was explaining was that
If everyone got divorced, it would.
No. In the case of divorce,
yeah.
it closes it because of the split.
Well, yes, let me just re-explain what I said before.
Yeah.
In a typical household, there's a big valued piece of real estate. The husband typically will leave the family home. The wife will say, I want the real estate so I can continue looking after the kids. Oh, and you can have this illiquid asset that I don't really understand, the super, you have that. Not in all cases, but that tends to happen.
Can I just comment too? Actually, even though we're dispensing with the idea of identity here, this really highlights the fact that when we think about structures, we do need to not always frame them in terms of gender, because on the one hand, we've got the risk pooling that Jeremy highlighted to us in terms of household accumulations. And then on the other hand, we've got structures that might be more typically related to women but are not specific to women. I think we've got to make sure we make policy around, we try and, we don't make policy around the idea that these are issues related to a particular gender.
No, that's right. And I think, you know, if you look at labour market changes, men will be in that category of part-time workers as the labour market is more and more fissured. And we're actually seeing that already with youth. I mean, that population from 29 under are really at risk at the moment.
So I have a number of people, but just here first.
Dying to say something. Louise Dupre-Elba, Australian Super. As someone who wrote our submission 3 years ago to the Senate inquiry on women's economic security in retirement, I'm really challenged by what Susan and Marian have both had to say. I started off thinking that, you know, super's gender blind. The problem is women don't earn enough money. What you've done today is demonstrate that I'm working in a system that actually discriminates against the way women live in society, so they have adverse retirement outcomes because of the way they participate in this society. So thank you, that's been really challenging. What I'm taking away from that too is that it's a system that's not fit for purpose for more than 50% of the people in it, in certain key aspects, including what you described about multiple accounts, which I think is one of the biggest problems we've got to tackle right now. So thank you, and I want to continue this discussion later on.
Okay, thank you.
So I have George next, but then if you could just pass the microphone in front. And then Andrew.
Yeah, George Kudner, CEPAR. It was quite interesting, Marian, to see that graph that you put up from RBA that tried to sort of explain what's behind the part-time work. And I would say that that would relate mainly to women, given that sort of, that proportionally. So it was quite interesting to see actually from that graph that's mainly a choice. There was a preference, 20%, and there was a childcare. Would you sort of agree with that? I mean, from my personal experience, that's how I feel.
Yes. I wished I hadn't put that graph up, actually, because I haven't got I need to go back and look at the questions they asked. I did read it again today on the plane thinking preference, because people answer questions, and I think Jeremy made this point too, depending on the way the question is framed. I think I better go back and check, because is it preference because I've got children? Do you write preference or do you write childcare? Is it preference because the job doesn't give me part-time work, so I write preference, or it's because of the inflexibility of the job? They're all options. So I need to check on that. I think it's a really good question, and maybe we need to go back to the original document.
One thing I think which would be very valuable to do on the basis of this research is communicate more about it. So one thing you could do with women who are thinking about, like take a woman who's thinking about going out of labor force to take care of a kid, they may not understand the financial implications of their decisions. And I think what you've done very well here is highlight the financial implications, and they're, maybe something CEPAR puts out actually. It's something that you're thinking about taking time off to be a carer. This has implications for you. Have you thought about them?
Yep.
Yeah. I do think that's a good idea, Mike. I mean, there is, and it would help, but we also know that when women have children, especially the first and second babies, actually the last thing they start to think about are those decisions. I mean, we see a similar issue happening with harassment or, well, actually job loss. I mean, we know a lot of women lose their job because of an organisational restructure at that time, and they don't fight it because there are so many other things going on. So I do think what you're suggesting is a good idea. We need to work out a way of providing that.
Might need to be done earlier.
Mainstream. Yeah, I think earlier is a good idea. Yeah.
So
Not
David?
at that point.
Yeah, thank you. I want to build on Louise's comment and thank Susan for highlighting some of the structural impediments and barriers, if you like, not only women but people in the part-time workforce. And in particular, your comment about insurance is really interesting because I think many insurance models or patterns have a fixed sum insured for a particular age. It starts off at 200,000 and then it gradually reduces as a person ages. So there is that fixed deduction, even though you're part-time, you're still paying the same insurance. In the Protecting Your Super package now before Parliament, there's insurance changes discussed there. I think we need to have a good look at how insurance is designed within the super space. I think it belongs there, but I don't think the designs are necessarily apt. Having said that, my question is though, if a woman is full-time then has a first or second child, she may want her full insurance because at that very point the household needs her covered.
Yeah, I feel like quite the hypocrite, David, for the very point you've exactly made, because the time when I took out a retail life insurance policy was actually when I was a full-time carer of my kids, because I knew how valuable my labour was to the household and how difficult I would have been to replace.
Rational investor.
Actually, though,
Totally rational.
you raise a really important point. I think that people have analyzed, and I've seen a lot of research analyzing gender gaps in the amounts accumulated. But insurance products have been around a really long time, and you could say that Super was designed by men, but I can guarantee these insurance products were designed by men. Now, the fact they've been around a really long time means they're very traditional. And a lot of the new circumstances they won't deal with very well. Whether they deal with women or part-time work or other things, they need to be looked at again, and there very well may be more discrimination in the insurance products than there is in the savings phase.
To pick up on that point too, Susan, I think when I had my first child, I resigned from work and took my super because I thought that would be great money to have. Now, that was a huge mistake because it was the best system in New South Wales and I would have been really, really rich now. But I had no idea, you know, because it was the fully contributed defined benefit scheme. But, whoops.
You can't sue a financial advisor or anything like that?
It was totally my own decision. And yeah, so... But, and I think there's a lot of women who do that because you think it's the right thing to do at the time.
Except you couldn't do that now because it would be preserved.
Yes, that's right. That's right. So that, yes, actually, so that's a good change. Yeah. Oh, right. Okay.
So I have Andrew Podger at the back who's been very patient, and then I have two more people I've recognised.
I was just going to make a very minor technical point following on from Jeremy's useful description of what happens on divorce. And the women taking the home and the men taking the superannuation. Of course, Pillar 1 or Pillar 0 does provide some compensation for that, in that the age pension exempts the home.
Yep.
So the women taking the home is not necessarily a bad idea at all. Other parts of the retirement income system do provide some protection for women in that area.
I think as the eligibility age drifts up, though, you're getting this kind of gap between the sort of late 50s and when that ticks up. But yes, you're right.
I have a question over here.
Just to add to Susan's really good list of structural issues, I mean, one of the question of longevity insurance, effectively, the women need it more than the men. And I think one of the reasons why we don't have annuities is the men are very happy to spend the money and leave their wives on the age pension.
It could be. I mean, so Anthony, the issue is like the gap in income. So like the mortality premium for men will be bigger, but the insurance element for women will be larger because there's going to be a wider span of lifespan. So the net effect's ambiguous, and I don't know the answer.
And women have more morbidity as well. That's true. We don't have annuities, and who would be the beneficiaries of the annuities? The widows.
Most annuities are reversionary, and what happens is...
It's unclear, it's ambiguous.
Well, you could have more.
You can't play.
Next question just here.
Just to add to the gender imbalance, if you put all the people you know age 85 in a room, 2/3 will be women, 1/3 will be men. The men will be much healthier, because they've survived. The other thing is the women will have more cognitive impairment, and that's clearly established. And the final thing is that the dependency, which is the remaining lifespan, part of the remaining lifespan, will be about twice as much for women as it will be for men. So what's typically happening is the men die just as they finish their, and as they finish their dependency, the women become dependent.
Yeah.
So there's some really serious social issues in labour.
Absolutely.
Can I just ask a question of you, though? I noticed that as women's increase in workforce participation, or as it began to increase from Napa Valley, I noticed that the men's participation began to drop. Do you think there's any connection?
I don't know if you're reading... So that's the overall participation. There are some explanations for that. One of them is structural change in the economy itself, so different jobs. So one of the major explanations given is as Australia has restructured economically and every recession, a certain group of men drop out and they don't return to the labour market. But the jobs that are created are in what we call the female dominating, as I said, health, education, personal services. And so we've got a sort of a demand and supply side thing happening at the same time as women's education levels have increased, which actually happened in the 70s quite dramatically. So women have, and we know this, women have quite radically altered their expectation of career in motherhood. So they enter a career before they enter motherhood, and they get to motherhood with a career behind them. before it used to, you went for a job and then motherhood straight away, and you might have gone to a job. So it's both an industry restructuring and education, and then social values changing. I think they're the sort of three big factors.
I mean, this has been
Germany would have had a similar thing. You're agreeing with my interpretation there, Axel? Yeah.
This has been a really rich session, and I just want to come back to particularly Susan's observations of the quantification of the impediments coming through the structure of the system. It seems like it's straightforward to fix, and it wouldn't have big fiscal implications. Any of the policymakers here who would like to comment, why isn't something done about this?
Well, I'll give you one example. So the multiple accounts, which has been re-looked at by the Productivity Commission, mentioned again today. It was recommended in my review, taken up by the government, and then just stared down by the industry.
Yeah.
Exactly the same thing happened in the UK.
Yeah, they make money.
Almost identical. One of the arguments used in Australia was because we default insurance into superannuation, which is true. There are some wrinkles and issues that needed to be, as you consolidate multiple accounts that might all have insurance in them, there are situations where you can actually lead to adverse consequences. You telescope it all into one policy, something's gone wrong in between, and that policy doesn't respond. But there are solutions to that, but it just dropped off the agenda because too many issues. There's no real incentive to get together and fix the problem.
So in the UK, you can request the transfer value once a year and transfer. Can you do that in Australia? You can't.
You can do it any time, but people don't do it.
You actually have to.
Do it. So there's inertia.
Historically, it was a terribly complex and cumbersome process, and you need the motivation and understanding to be able to do it.
Okay.
Why can't we just make it you're only allowed to have one eligible fund and the tax office merges them? It's a default scheme, I know.
But yeah.
So I saw a hand up here before.
Yeah.
Thanks. Helen Hodgson from Curtin, and I look at all of this stuff through a gender lens. So there's a few comments that have come through. First of all, the issue around divorce. It's true to say that everything goes in the pot and everything is divided. It's also true to say that more often than not the woman takes the real estate and that is exempt from the pension under the pension means tests. One of the problems, though, is what happens with earning capacity in that situation. So more often than not, the woman has a much lower earning capacity. So while the man recovers, I'm sorry, I'm being very gendered when I say this, but yeah, the husband will recover his earning capacity, his super, and also have the capacity to buy another house. She has the kids, a part-time job and a mortgage. And so there's still disadvantages when you get to the end of that. And that sort of leads into one of the other comments. A lot of the work I've done recently in the last year has been around older renters. And it's come up a few times today. And there's a very serious mismatch going on there between the expectation that people own a home, which is true for 60% or whatever the number is now, but is reducing. And I did notice Marian's comment about increases in the pension, but it's actually the CRA that needs to be addressed, the Commonwealth Rent Assistance, because we have a system where there's not enough going into public housing or social housing. There's very little in the way of affordable rentals. And the research, the project we released last month basically showed that if you've got an older person in a house that's inappropriate, it's often the first stage of a descent into aged care. And it's far more expensive to subsidise somebody in aged care than it is to give them a little bit more rent assistance and the ability to have an appropriately modified house. And then the final point that's come up is the one around insurance issues. And I did raise this at the CEPAR conference in July because I'm doing a bit of work in this space too. One of the concerns, and I think that was referred to by the panel, is whether you're in the position to make the best decisions. So if we have an opt-out system, unless people are prompted to review that decision regularly when their life circumstances change, you can have a situation where, and to go back to a comment that was raised earlier, there's no life policy and insurance for when somebody does pass away and the widow has nothing except a very basic level of protection there. So, yeah, I'd just be interested to see what the panel has to say.
Who'd like to go first?
I'll quickly, thank you, Helen. I know you're doing a lot of terrific work in that area. So the rent assistance one is a clear policy area, and housing for women particularly at older age. I think that's a great idea. And a policy area we have to pursue. The second point was...
talk about insurance and the divorce and the fact that women earn less after...
Yes, I mean, I think, I don't know much about the insurance. I'll leave that to the other members of the panel, but that's a really interesting issue to observe too, and quite well studied in sort of the sociology literature as well. And you're right, because of those life patterns that I've explained of women, they've often haven't been able to maintain the skill level job that their partners have. They then take the care of the children. They then aren't able to re-enter the labour market at the same levels, and they generally work part-time because they're trying to accommodate the care with the house. And even if they've paid off the mortgage, they have the asset, but they may not have enough income to support the life, so they're forced to sell the house, and then you're in another cycle. Yes, I don't know enough about the insurance.
I mean, the argument here is really that the human capital should be factored into the splitting, so that if you just split based on financial assets, it's not fair to the person who has lower human capital, whether it's a woman or a man, likely to be a woman. You should factor in their total potential earnings too, and split that. And maybe adjust for risk or something like that. Now, the point I'd make about the availability of housing, though, is, and this is, again, I like to bring general concerns because I find that people talk about one aspect of an issue, but then there's another aspect that needs attention. And I find that a lot of times people talk about people not saving enough for retirement, but then I also worry about the infrastructure for supporting retirement in society. And a lot of times you hear about savings gaps, but then houses are not being built with appropriate facilities for handicapped people. So I am really worried about the supply of these houses. So, I mean, it's fine to give a little bit of assistance. And I was talking to someone at lunch about insurance that would convert if someone needed to convert their house. It would there are practical issues in terms of moral hazard with it. But I mean, there are big issues with the supply of the stock of housing. If you project what's going to happen in different countries going forward, how ready are they to handle an aging population? And so, just giving the assistance might work for some people, but I worry about the macroeconomic effects in 10 or 15 years. The supply issues are really important.
Did any other panellists want to respond at this point? No. We have a question at the back.
It's a question about advice. So the Retirement Income Covenant introduced the concept of guidance, and I've heard guided choice spoken about a couple of times today. I was hoping Darren would be here to answer this, but I don't know if anyone else in the panel, Jeremy, perhaps you, have any thoughts on what guidance means, because it's not reflected in the current advice framework. The current advice framework has general advice, personal advice, and a few other, intra-fund scaled and so on. But this notion of guidance has kind of crept into the vernacular without really any meaning of what it means.
Yeah, I think we'll ultimately end up, well, fortunately and unfortunately, with yet another little sort of regulatory space all of its own that relates to giving people advice about these products. And without wanting to speak for Darren, I think sometimes advice is a little bit of a tail that wags the dog. The more you sort of talk about advice, the more it sort of overtakes. I can see other former regulators nodding here, but it tends to overtake everything else in the discussion. Now, clearly, I think there is going to need to be clarity around what you can do that goes beyond general advice in this specific space, but doesn't end up being personal advice. But I guess all of those who are involved in the project are trying to sort of, we'll get to that. There'll have to be some boundaries and some clarity around it. But let's not talk so much about that. Let's focus on the hundreds of other issues that are actually in it. And I think at the end the policymakers will just do a nice sweep up and say, if you're dealing with a CEPAR, you can do this, this, this and this, and it won't be regarded as personal advice. That's my take on it.
David? Oh, we've got a lot of hands all of a sudden going up.
Proving my theory, perhaps.
I know I've spoken already at this session, but I just thought I'd make a couple of comments on multiple accounts, because multiple accounts are a really important issue, and I think we've got 3 developments happening currently that will help. One is the budget measures, where we will 5 to 6 million accounts will be swept to the tax office. That's step one. Step two is MyGov, where people's accounts are shown and you can actually consolidate your accounts on MyGov.
Yep.
The third thing is single touch payroll. And single touch payroll, when you go to a new employer in 2 or 3 years' time, your current accounts will be shown and you will be able to choose where your SG goes. So you don't have to take the new default fund. I think those 3 steps, not going to fully solve the problem, but they're all steps in the right direction.
Yep.
And just to pick up the point as to whether we should just have one account only, I actually have 3 accounts, but one is a defined benefit pension, and I'm not giving that away. The second comment, I think we need to recognise many SMSFs have an account in the APRA fund system for group life insurance.
Yep.
So people sometimes deliberately have multiple accounts for good reason.
Yeah, I think that very important points to make, and David, you are the exception that proves the rule. But what we do need is a default system that doesn't produce multiple accounts.
I have no problems with trying to. Yep.
Seeing there's a gender take on a lot of things today, I will say that women are far better account consolidators than men. If you look, as women get into their 50s, you'll find that the number of accounts they've got decreases, and it's startlingly less than men of the same age.
So I think we've got time for one more question. I saw about 5 hands. Whoever puts up their hand, okay.
And he was close to the mic as well.
Rafael Chomik from CEPAR. I've got a question about the $450 threshold. It's come up a few times today, the idea that perhaps we should lower that. It's actually been lowering over time because wages have been going up and the level the threshold has stayed the same. But there's also an argument that it would affect people who are most credit constrained. They're the ones that are essentially people who are financially stressed. So it's possible that by lowering it, those people might lose wages because employers will take it out of wages, and they'll be even more financially stressed. What do the panel think of that?
It's a good point. I think that the sister issue is the fake contractors. Now, being a bit of a pension geek, every time I get into a cab, I will have the superannuation discussion with the driver. Not every time, but often. They nearly run off. At that point, they fall asleep and start veering off the road. But no, I am absolutely staggered. Almost none of them have super. Absolutely don't even know where to start. So that's as big an issue. The 450 is an issue, but that is an enormous issue.
I think it is a very sensitive area at the moment, Raf, but I mean, I suppose I would say that a lot of employers are not paying the right wages anyway. So if they were forced to go into a scheme, it might actually force people to pay what they're supposed to be paying, because it'd be much more obvious what's happening. And those people on such low wages should be getting more per hour anyway. I know it's a problem. Perhaps we can use, there is that policy. I have to admit, I don't know the super system. I'm a late comer to that. I've done every women's lives until I get to this point. But that extra bit that if the government puts in 1,000 matches, co-contribution. I wonder if we could use that in some way to sort of ease out that issue.
Having a minimum wage and the Fair Work Commission not taking into account the fact that they're also getting super, and keeping that minimum wage would mean that they don't actually lose because employers can't reduce the wage any further.
Well, in fact, I don't think the Fair Work Commission really counts super into their considerations of the minimum wage anymore. And don't forget, we have more than one minimum wage in Australia. We have the minimum wage, and then we have award minimums, and the people in those different jobs would actually be receiving the award minimum plus the super, which would actually give them a bonus percent. Our system, our superannuation system is complicated, but so is our industrial relations and award system. But if you put all the bits together, I think we can work it out.
I actually think it'd be easier for the tax office to see
Yeah.
assess super guarantee compliance by employers if every employee they had super guarantee.
Yes, I suppose that's the point I was trying to get to. That would be actually a benefit, wouldn't it? It would be transparent.
In the kindred space, of course, you've got all the black economy jobs that are being paid in cash, at around about that level as well. Now, I don't know quite what you do about those.
I think it's a good thing to bear in mind, though, also in relation to a lot of the advocacy for increasing contribution rates from 9.5 to 12. So if we stretch the if we include everyone at the very low margins, should we actually increase contribution rates at the same time? I've got to say the economist in me feels a bit queasy about forcing everybody to contribute and then forcing them to contribute more. Not sure it's good.
Yeah, but if you look at the distribution between profits and wages in Australia now, it's just completely split. So, I mean, it's time for employers to pay up, actually. I'm not asking employees to pay. That's really where it should come from.
I'm worried about the next recession in Australia. I mean, I know it hasn't happened. There's a cover in The Economist that's really weird.
We haven't had one.
I mean, we can do all these things, and across the world, the labour share has gone down, and it's been a big issue. But I really worry, you put these changes in, like have everyone in super, it's going to be one of the first things that goes when there's a recession. Why? And I think because people want people employed. They want them to get back to work.
I think that's a very US-centric view, to be honest, and I don't.
It may not happen, but I'm skeptical about governments when a crisis occurs. They tend to do things that are pretty short term, and I think we need to think ahead to what a government might do in a recession, whatever it is. It might be different than the US. And make sure it's whatever changes, and there are a lot of good changes to make, that they're sustainable.
Germany actually did exactly the opposite. So after 2008, they increased the wage subsidy.
Sometimes it's impossible to predict what
that actually was pretty good for policy after all.
Yeah.
So I think on that very optimistic note, we should draw this session to an end. I always enjoy workshops and conferences where I learn something, and in this one I've learned a whole lot of things. So thank you for the 4 panellists for excellent discussion. Thank you for the questions from the floor. And I now hand over to our fearless leader, Professor John Piggott.
So it just remains for me to say a few words in closing, and I'm going to keep it brief. I'd like to thank all the speakers and presenters and chairs today. I think it's been a very stimulating session, and it's not just Warwick who's learned a lot, I've learned a lot as well, and I think many people in the room have. So please first of all join me in thanking all those who participated. It's also a great pleasure to work with the Crawford School. Crawford School is a premier school of public policy in the country, and I think it's a wonderful alliance to have if we're going to have policy influence out of CEPAR. This is the second or third or fourth time that we've collaborated in one way or another with Crawford, and it's always been successful. And so I'd like to acknowledge that. And I'd also like to thank, these things don't get put together easily. I'd like to thank some professional staff. From Crawford, there's Rosana Bastos-Pinto, who is very centrally involved in this. And from CEPAR, there was a team of people led by Anne Gordon, but also Joanna Bayliss, Silke Weiss, and Amy Brushwood, and they all made a terrific contribution to make the day a success. So look, in closing, could I ask you to join me in showing my appreciation to them? And finally, don't forget these. These were an enormous amount of work by Ralph Hormick and his team, 130 pages of truth about the retirement income system in Australia. And I really think there'll be a reference source for a long time to come. There are copies outside. Please make use of them. Thank you.